everyone, Nurse Wendy back again. I wanted to talk today about some COVID terminology. When school starts and we're making decisions about possible exposures and cases, I want to make sure we're all using the same language. So I want to start off with what an exposure is when we talk about someone who is close to someone else who has COVID. Exposure means you've been inside of 6 feet for 15 minutes or more, and it doesn't matter whether or not you have a face covering in order to determine whether or not there's been an exposure. Two other terms that are really important to understand are when you have a positive COVID case, a confirmed case, obviously that's someone who's had an actual test and it has come back positive. Sometimes there'll be somebody who's sick and does not have a positive case and ends up being something we call a presumed case. Let me explain what that is. So if you don't have a positive case, but you've been exposed to someone who is a confirmed case and you have 2 or more of the major symptoms of COVID, fever, coughing, shortness of breath, or loss of sense and smell, and you don't have another diagnosis for what might be causing those symptoms, that's called a presumed case. That becomes really important because sometimes if you test really early, after you've been exposed, you could have a false negative. The next term I want to talk about is the word quarantine. Quarantine is something that happens for someone who's not sick. Quarantine is when we have somebody who's away from other people for a period of time to watch to see if symptoms develop. In COVID-19, symptoms most often emerge between the 2nd and the 6th day after exposure, but they can emerge as late as 14 days after exposure. So the length of time that someone is quarantined for COVID-19 is 14 days after their last exposure. So if you were exposed one day, you count 14 days, and that's when your quarantine would end. By contrast, isolation is what we call it when someone who is sick is removed from other people. Now, in COVID-19, we know that people are contagious generally for 10 days. So the length of time that someone is isolated when they're sick is 10 days. And so in order to come back to work or school after someone is a positive COVID case is 10 days so that they're not contagious and 24 hours without a fever, without fever-reducing medications, and all other symptoms are improving. So quarantine is when people who are not sick stay away to watch to see if symptoms develop, and isolation is when people who are sick stay away from other people so that they don't spread the disease. The next thing I want to talk about is quarantine protocols. So in a school, if there's a close contact, the first thing everybody needs to know is that we are partners with the public health department. And so what would happen is if there is a report of an exposure or a confirmed case, I will reach out to the health department to confirm that there's a case, and then we look and see what the date of that case is, when that person was contagious, if that person was around other people, and then make decisions about what needs to happen. So if there's someone who is ill and confirmed with COVID, and someone else is around them within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more, they are considered a close contact. So the person who is sick will isolate and the close contact will quarantine. Everyone's next question is, what if we were a close contact of that person who was a close contact of that person who's quarantining? Well, the answer is the close contact of the close contact doesn't quarantine because the person who's quarantining isn't sick. So why would we take the close contact of a close contact and make them stay home? I want to give you an example. Let's say there is a family and one of the parents becomes ill and the student goes to school and we find out that the parent is ill. The student obviously has been with their family and that student is a close contact of the parent who is ill. That student's been in school, but the student's not ill. All of the classmates are fine because they're close contacts of the close contact, which is a student. So the family and the student would quarantine and the classmates would be just fine. For every instance when there may be an exposure, the health department will look very carefully at who is the ill person, who the close contacts are, whether the person who is around other people has been contagious, and make decisions based on medicine and science about who needs to be quarantined, if anybody, in the school setting. So I want to be clear about how the school helps the public health department in all of this process. One of the things that's very important, and we've talked about it before and we'll talk about it again, is that students are broken up into groups called cohorts. We're very clear through taking attendance records and paying attention to where adults are, knowing who's been in contact with whom. So we track the cohorts, we track where students and staff are, and if there is some kind of an exposure, we give that information to the health department. They do something called contact tracing. So we track the cohorts and give them that information, and they do contact tracing, which means, and this happens not just in the school setting, but all over the place, when the public health department determines that there's been a COVID case, they figure out who may have been in close contact with that case, and they make telephone calls to make sure that anybody who may have been exposed is aware. They work with people in the community to determine who should be isolating if they're sick, and who should be quarantining, and for how long. We're just part of that bigger process of public health. So I'm excited to take this opportunity to share with you what these words all mean, because it can be confusing, and again, we're trying to minimize confusion and minimize anxieties. When we open, we want you to understand that we're very clear about the process. We know exactly what we would do in all of these instances to make sure that everybody stays safe in our community. I look forward to talking to you again soon. See you later.